She was sure that it was just a normal ant hill in her garden, but when the experts arrived and began to examine the soil, they immediately turned pale and ordered the woman to hide in the house immediately. What was hidden underground turned out to be many times more terrifying than she could have imagined. Subscribe and write in the comments. Would you dare to look inside such a hill? Sophia Carter had lived in her modest house on the outskirts of St. Martin Parish in Louisiana for nearly 15 years. It was not a large home, nothing more than a weathered wooden structure with faded white paint that peeled away at the edges, but it was hers. She had inherited it from her late husband's family after his passing, and though at times it felt too large and too quiet for just one woman and her aging dog, it had become her sanctuary. The garden behind the house was her pride. A patchwork of vegetables, flowers, and fruit bushes that kept her occupied during the long, humid evenings when the air seemed thick enough to drink. Gardening was not simply a hobby for her, it was a way to soothe her mind after long shifts at the local clinic where she worked as a nurse, tending to people who often carried more burdens than their bodies could bear. Out there, among the rows of tomatoes, peppers, beans, and the sweet scent of blooming magnolias, she could forget the exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders and feel connected to something steady and alive. It was during one of those evenings, when the sun was sinking low and spreading gold across the horizon, that she first noticed the small mound of earth near the far corner of her yard. It was close to the fence where the soil was darker and damper from the drainage that ran off into the shallow ditch beyond. At first, she barely paid attention, thinking it the work of a mole, tunneling bunnies, or perhaps a harmless ant hill, which was common in the region. Louisiana yards were full of ant colonies, especially in summer when the ground seemed to pulse with hidden life. She knelt to look closer, brushing away a few blades of grass that had grown around the mound. The soil looked looser than usual, as though it had been freshly turned from beneath. Sophia frowned lightly but then shrugged, standing again to wipe her hands on her gardening gloves. There was no sense worrying over something so trivial. The following morning, however, when she returned with her watering can, she noticed the mound again. This time, it appeared slightly larger, its surface cracked and uneven as though something beneath had been pushing upward. She bent down, pressing her fingers into the earth. It was strangely soft, yielding more quickly than she expected. A faint, musty smell rose from it, earthy and damp, carrying the scent of the swampy areas she knew lay not far beyond her neighborhood. She straightened, pulling her gloves off, and muttered to herself that it must be a colony of ants working their way up. That was not unusual, though she could not recall ever seeing one grow so fast in just a day. Over the course of the next week, Sophia became increasingly aware of the mound's persistence. Each evening, when she returned from the clinic, she found it larger. The surface soil seemed churned and disturbed, as though restless hands had clawed at it from below. The small pile had grown from a lump the size of a fist into something resembling a miniature hill, about the width of a small basin. She crouched beside it, poking gently with a gardening spade, and noticed that the soil fell away easily, almost crumbling into airy clumps. What struck her most was the texture. It was not densely packed the way ant hills usually were instead. It was riddled with tiny passages too small for her to peer into but enough to suggest a maze beneath. Still, she told herself not to worry. She had lived long enough in Louisiana to know that the land teemed with insects and animals, and that most of them minded their business unless disturbed. She continued watering her rows of beans and pruning the wilting leaves off her tomatoes, yet she could not help glancing back at the mound each time she crossed the garden, as though it had grown an unsettling presence, a quiet occupant of a space that demanded to be acknowledged. Her dog, a shepherd mix with more grey than black in his muzzle, seemed to notice it too. One evening, when Sophia was bending near her flower bed, she saw the dog stand a few yards from the mound, ears perked and body tense. He growled softly, his tail stiff. Sophia looked at him in surprise, then followed his gaze to the mound, which sat silent and unchanging in the dim light. "It's nothing," she said aloud, though she felt uneasy hearing her own voice sound so dismissive. She whistled for the dog, and though he reluctantly came to her side, he kept glancing back as if wary of something he could sense but she could not. By the end of the second week, the mound had doubled in size. It was now too large to ignore, rising nearly to her knees, a swelling bulge of soil that disrupted the smooth order of her garden. Sophia tried to convince herself that it was simply an unusually active ant colony. She had read about fire ants creating enormous mounds, though she had never seen one this large in her own yard. Yet there was something about the way the soil kept shifting that made her hesitate. Some mornings, she could swear it looked taller than it had been the night before, and the grass around her had begun to yellow, as though drained of vitality. She remembered her grandmother's old sayings about the land. That the ground itself was alive, and sometimes it spoke through the signs it gave if only one knew how to read them. Sophia brushed the thought away, but the words lingered like an echo at the back of her mind. She did not believe in omens or superstitions. Still, as she stood staring at the mound under the humid twilight sky, she felt something stir inside her, a vague apprehension she could not quite name. That night, when the cicadas droned loudly and the trees and the heavy air clung to her skin, she found herself waking from sleep to an unfamiliar sound. It was faint, muffled, like the whisper of dry leaves being stirred. At first, she thought it was the wind in the magnolia branches outside her window, but when she held her breath and listened, she realized it came from the direction of the garden. It was not a loud noise, not enough to alarm her fully, but there was a rhythm to it, a steady shift as though something moved beneath the earth. Sophia sat up in bed, heart beating faster, but after a long while, the sound faded, leaving only the drone of insects outside. She lay back down, staring into the dark, unable to shake the image of the mound slowly rising and falling as if breathing. The next morning, she returned to the garden, and sure enough, the mound had grown again. It was now accompanied by a smaller rise of earth a few feet away, subtle but distinct, like a budding sibling to the larger hill. Sophia pressed her lips together, unease prickling the back of her neck. Perhaps it was time to do something about it, she thought, though she was still reluctant to admit it could be a real problem. She knelt and touched the soil again, feeling its strange looseness, and told herself she would handle it before it spread any further. For now, however, she tried to carry on with her day, though the mound remained fixed in her thoughts. As she tended to her patients at the clinic, handing out prescriptions and changing dressings, she found her mind wandering back to her garden. She could picture the earth shifting silently, expanding when she was not there to watch. The image unsettled her, but she pushed it away each time, determined not to let her imagination get the better of her. Yet in the quiet of the evening, when she stood at her kitchen window looking out across a yard, she felt a chill despite the heat. The mound sat there like an uninvited guest, patient and insistent, growing in its own secret rhythm. Sophia could not have known then that the quiet rise of earth would soon mark the beginning of something that would change her life entirely. The days following her discovery of the second, smaller rise in the soil unsettled Sophia more than she cared to admit. The mound had become a fixture in her life, as though it were not simply a natural occurrence but an entity in its own right, a silent presence that drew her eyes every time she stepped outside. Her dog no longer wandered near it at all. He gave it a wide berth, sometimes stopping and growling low in his throat, the hackles along his back lifting as if warning her of something she herself refused to acknowledge. Sophia found herself laughing nervously at him, speaking aloud in the heavy stillness of her yard to reassure both herself and the animal that it was only earth and insects, nothing more sinister. Yet her own words fell flat, lacking conviction. The mound was growing, and pretending otherwise no longer soothed her nerves. At first, she resolved to tackle the matter with the simple, practical methods she had seen her neighbors use whenever ants or burrowing animals caused problems in their lawns. She dragged the garden hose across the yard, uncoiling it with a determined jerk of her wrist. The summer heat was already pressing down, sweat forming on her brow as she turned the metal nozzle and watched water arc through the air, glinting in the sunlight before splattering into the mound. At first, the soil grew dark and slick, but she noticed quickly that the water did not pool as she expected. Instead, it disappeared almost instantly, sucked into the earth with a faint hiss. It was as though the ground beneath the mound drank greedily, swallowing gallon after gallon without resistance. She kept the water flowing, biting her lip as the soil surface collapsed into itself, forming tiny sinkholes. Yet no matter how long she sprayed, the mound refused to crumble. It seemed instead to absorb the flood the way parched lips absorb cool water. When at last she shut off the hose, panting in the heat, the mound looked damp and broken in places, but by the following morning, it appeared not weakened but strangely reinforced, the soil packed tighter and standing taller than before. She tried again the next evening, this time with more force. She stabbed the spout of the hose directly into the top of the mound, forcing water deep inside. The earth gave way easily, collapsing into air pockets beneath. She crouched closer, peering at the opening, and thought she caught a whiff of something foul drifting upward, a musty, heavy organic odor like decaying leaves mixed with something more acrid. She gagged softly and pulled back but forced herself to keep spraying. The water gurgled and disappeared into the hidden chambers, and she realized with a sharp pang of fear that the mound was not a simple pile of dirt but part of a hollow system, a labyrinth concealed beneath her garden. She withdrew at last, shutting off the hose, and stood staring at the darkening earth until the evening light faded. By the next day, the mound had dried, the soil surface hard and cracked, and it was visibly taller again. She cursed under her breath, a rare sound from her lips. The sensation of helplessness sat like a stone in her chest. She could not abide the thought of something taking over her garden, this one place where she felt control and comfort. So she decided to fight harder. She fetched a spade, a well-used tool with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of work, and struck it into the mound. The soil gave way with alarming ease. It was loose, airy, riddled with voids. She dug down, pushing deeper, and with each thrust of the blade, the ground seemed to collapse more quickly, as if it had been undermined far below the surface. She scooped up a shovelful of dirt and found it riddled with fine holes, hundreds of tiny passages pressed through like veins. She crouched lower, trying to glimpse what might lie beneath, but only darkness greeted her. The silence unnerved her, for she expected to see ants swarming furiously after being disturbed. Yet there was nothing at first, only stillness, as though the colony below held its breath. She stepped back, wiping sweat and soil from her forehead, when a faint shiver passed through the mound. The surface seemed to tremble ever so slightly, and she dropped the spade with a sharp gasp. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were fractured, filled with images of hollow tunnels beneath her feet, stretching endlessly like the bones of some giant buried beneath the earth. She woke often, hearing noises she could not define, a distant rustle, a muffled vibration, always coming from the yard. When dawn arrived, she walked outside with her coffee and froze at the sight before her. The mound stood taller than ever, broader at the base, and beside it, 2 new rises had emerged. Smaller, yes, but undeniable. They seemed to have sprouted overnight, like mushrooms after rain. Sophia pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around the mug until it burned her palms. She had fought with water and steel, and yet the mounds multiplied. Still, she refused to yield. On her way home from work, she stopped at the hardware store and purchased a container of powder insecticide, the kind specifically advertised as effective against ants of all kinds. She returned to the garden at twilight, scattering the white granules over the surface of the mound, ensuring they dusted the openings and crevices. She sprinkled them on the smaller rises too, her hands trembling despite her effort to remain steady. The powder gleamed faintly in the fading light, like frost clinging to the darker earth. Satisfied, she stood back, brushing her hands together. Surely this would end it. Surely by morning, the colony would weaken and collapse. But her hope dissolved almost immediately. Within minutes of the powder settling, movement began. The soil quavered, shifted, and then a tide of insects erupted from the openings. At first, they seemed no different from ordinary ants, small, red-brown bodies scurrying furiously across the surface. But they came in such numbers that the earth itself seemed to crawl. They swarmed over the powder, carrying it away, scattering it as though it were no more than dust in their path. Their motion was frenzied, purposeful, and Sophia felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized they were not deterred but agitated. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over the hose coiled at her feet, her heart hammering as she watched the ground rise. The sight filled her with a deep, primal dread. That night, the noises grew louder. From her bed, she heard the distinct rustle of countless tiny bodies shifting beneath the earth. The sound reminded her of dry paper tearing slowly, again and again, or of a heavy fabric being dragged across the floor. The dog refused to come inside, pacing restlessly at the back door, whining low and mournful. Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her skin prickling with unease. The weight of helplessness pressed down harder than ever. She had tried water, she had tried digging, she had tried poison. And all had failed. Worse, her effort seemed only to provoke the hidden colony, integrating activity. In the early morning hours, when the air was heavy with mist and the world still grey, she rose and stepped barefoot to the back door. Through the glass, she could see the mounds, their shapes looming like shadows in the pale light. The largest had grown broader, its surface cracked open to reveal deeper cavities. The 2 smaller mounds had swelled, nearly matching the first. And beyond them, scattered across the yard, she thought she could discern yet more faint rises, as though the infestation was spreading unchecked, multiplying beneath her very feet. She pressed a hand to the door frame, her breath shuddering out of her lungs. Sophia had never been a woman prone to panic. She had raised children, cared for dying relatives, endured long shifts at the clinic where emergencies were constant and composure was a necessity. But now, in the quiet dawn, she found a rare and consuming fear. Her attempts to assert control over the land had failed completely. Whatever force lived beneath the soil was stronger, more numerous, more relentless than she had imagined, not simply an inconvenience. It was a threat. She could no longer convince herself that she was dealing with ordinary ants. She could no longer ignore the way the ground seemed alive, swelling and pulsing with a hidden rhythm. As the sun began to rise, casting light across a yard, Sophia made her decision. She could not fight this thing alone. She could not let her stubborn pride blind her any longer. Her garden, her sanctuary, had become a place of menace, and her safety was at stake. She would call for help. She would bring in those with knowledge and equipment she did not possess. Yet even as she resolved to make the call, she could not shake the heavyweight in her chest, the sense that whatever dwelled beneath the soil was far beyond anything ordinary pest control had ever encountered. And as she turned away from the window, her eyes lingering on the restless shapes of the mounds one last time, she felt the creeping certainty that she had already waited too long. The decision to call for help lingered uneasily in her mind through the night after her latest futile attempt to fight back the infestation. She had lain awake again, listening to the restless hum that seemed to come from the very soil beneath her garden. It was louder now, unmistakable, a kind of whispering vibration that sometimes swelled so that the floorboards of her bedroom seemed to tremble faintly. By morning, her nerves were stretched thin, her eyes red from lack of rest, and yet she still rose as she always did, put on her slippers, and went to the back door to look outside. What she saw made her stomach tighten into a hard knot. The single large mound had grown into a broad, uneven hill that stretched across the corner of the yard, but it was no longer alone. All around it, scattered at irregular distances, new mounds had risen. They were smaller but unmistakably of the same kind, their surfaces cracked and disturbed as if something beneath had turned violently through the night. Sophia counted at least a dozen, some no larger than her shoe, others already knee-high. They were spreading outward in every direction, encroaching toward her flower beds, her vegetable rows, even toward the patio where she sometimes sat in the evenings. It was as though the ground itself had been infected, and the infestation was creeping steadily closer to her home. Her dog stood stiff-legged on the porch, hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He refused to step down into the grass, his ears pinned back and his tail rigid. Sophia glanced down at him and saw in his tense posture a reflection of her own unspoken fear. Animals often sense danger long before people admitted to it, and she had no doubt now that whatever lived beneath her soil was more than a nuisance. It was a presence that disturbed the very air around it. Summoning what courage she could, Sophia stepped off the porch and approached the largest mound. The morning sun slanted across the yard, casting deep shadows in the cracks that marred its surface. She crouched carefully, leaning close, and saw the earth shifting ever so slightly, rising and falling as though it breathed. A shudder ran through her body, and she reached instinctively for the spade she had left thrust into the ground nearby. With slow, deliberate motion, she prodded the mound, the tip of the spade sinking easily into the loose soil. The moment the earth was disturbed, the surface seemed to ripple, fine grains of dirt crumbling away, and then came a faint skittering sound from within. Sophia jerked back, heart hammering, and in that instant, a handful of insects burst forth from one of the cracks. They were ants, yes, but not like the small black ones that invaded kitchens or the red ones she had seen biting ankles at picnics. These were larger, their bodies a dark reddish-brown that gleamed in the sun, their mandibles sharp and restless. They moved with terrifying coordination, flowing out of the opening and arriving in line, spilling over the mound onto the grass. Sophia staggered back, clutching the spade like a weapon, but the insects did not pursue her far. They swarmed across the surface of the mound, agitated, carrying grains of soil in their jaws and scurrying back into the cracks. It was not a mindless frenzy but an organized response, as if her probing had triggered some defensive measure. Watching them work in unison, she felt a chill of recognition. This was not just a colony, it was a vast, intelligent machine of countless tiny parts. She fled back to the porch, her breath ragged, and pulled her dog inside with her. From the kitchen window, she continued to watch, pressing her palms flat against the counter to steady herself. The ants vanished once more beneath the earth, but the mounds continued to tremble, faint vibrations that sent trickles of soil tumbling down their sides. She could not escape the impression that the ground beneath her home was hollow, riddled with tunnels that stretched far wider than her yard alone. Later that day, as she tried to distract herself with chores, Sophia noticed something even more alarming. The plants closest to the mounds were wilting. Her tomato vines, once strong and green, hung limp, their leaves curling and yellowing despite her careful watering. The bean plants sagged against their stakes, and the marigold she had planted as a cheerful border had lost their brightness. Kneeling to touch the soil near the roots, she found it strangely dry, crumbly, as though drained of moisture. The realization sank in slowly but inexorably. Whatever dwelled beneath was sucking the life from the ground itself, beyond the air or sustenance, and leaving the surface barren. By the second night, her unease had turned to dread. The noises in the dark were no longer faint but insistent, a restless crackling that seemed to spread beneath the entire yard. Once or twice, she thought she even felt her bed vibrate softly, as though the unseen network below was expanding, reshaping itself. She sat upright for hours, clutching a flashlight, though she knew no beam of light could penetrate the soil to reveal what hid there. The dog lay at her feet, whining softly and refusing to leave her side. The next morning, she tested the ground with cautious steps, venturing only far enough to see that the infestation had advanced again. New mounds dotted the far side of the yard now, nearer the vegetable rows, forming a grim constellation that spread wider with each passing day. She thought of the neighbors beyond the fence and wondered whether the network of tunnels already stretched beneath their properties too, unseen. The thought of it spreading unchecked filled her with a sick kind of dread. In a last desperate attempt to assert control, Sophia retrieved the container of insecticide powder she had bought and scattered more of it across the newest mounds. This time, the reaction was immediate and violent. Ants poured from the earth in a seething torrent, rushing over her shoes and up the legs of her jeans. She cried out and stumbled back, slapping her ankles, her heart hammering as the insects swarmed in coordinated waves. She retreated to the safety of the porch, trembling with shock, and watched as they carried away the powder grain by grain, neutralizing her efforts with chilling efficiency. It was not simply that the poison had failed, it was that the colony had adapted, as though it anticipated her moves and countered them. Sophia shut herself inside, pulling the curtains tight, though daylight still streamed through the gaps. She sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling around a cooling cup of coffee, and admitted to herself what she had resisted for too long. This was no ordinary problem, no household nuisance she could solve with tools and determination. She had exhausted every method she knew, and all had failed. The infestation was spreading faster now, feeding on her soil, growing bolder with each passing hour. The fear that had gnawed at her quietly in the beginning now surged openly in her chest, undeniable and consuming. As dusk fell and the vibrations beneath her house returned with renewed strength, Sophia knew she could no longer put off the inevitable. She would have to call for help immediately. Yet even as she reached for the phone, she could not shake the terrible certainty that whatever professionals arrived to investigate would discover something far worse than she herself could imagine. The changes in her garden were not simply disturbing, they were warnings, and she feared deeply that it was already far too late. Sophia had not touched her breakfast. The untouched plate of eggs had long since cooled and hardened on the table, but she hardly noticed. Her hands lay clasped together, fingers interlaced so tightly that her knuckles were white, and she sat staring at the small screen of her phone as though willing it to dial on its own. All through the long night, she had listened to the unsettling chorus beneath her yard. The restless shifting, the faint tearing sound as if soil was being ripped apart, the strange impression that the very ground surrounding her home was alive. She had woken from uneasy dreams more than once, with her heart hammering, convinced that she had felt the floor tremble softly, as though the house itself were caught in the slow breathing of something monstrous buried beneath. Now, in the grey light of dawn, she could no longer put off the decision. Her efforts had failed, her garden was being consumed, the infestation was spreading. She was in danger. The phone felt heavy in her hand as she finally lifted it and tapped in the number for the local pest control service. She had memorized it the night before but had delayed, clinging foolishly to the hope that morning light would show her things were not so bad, that perhaps she had exaggerated in her exhaustion. Yet when she had drawn back the curtains moments earlier, the sight had stolen her breath away. The largest mound had spread outward like an advancing tide, its bulk now 3 times the size it had been only days earlier. Around it, the smaller mounds had multiplied again. Where yesterday she had counted perhaps a dozen, now there were many more, some only low rises in the grass, but others swelling quickly into new hills. They crept closer to the patio, to the flower beds, even to the base of the steps leading up to her porch. The soil all around them was disrupted, cracked and shifting, as if riddled with hollow spaces. When the call connected, a calm female voice greeted her, asking how she could help. Sophia tried to explain, stumbling over her words in her urgency. She spoke of mounds of soil that swallowed water and refused to collapse, of strange vibrations and noises at night, of insects larger and more aggressive than any she had seen. There was silence on the other end for a moment before the voice replied in a carefully even tone, asking if she was certain they were not simply fire ants, which were common and dangerous but not unusual in the region. Sophia insisted, her voice rising, that this was something different, something worse, that the infestation was spreading across her entire yard in a matter of days. She could hear the doubt in the operator's voice, could almost picture the raised eyebrow, the faint smile reserved for people prone to exaggeration. But desperation lent her strength, and she begged them to come quickly, to send a team that day, that morning if possible. At last, the operator promised to dispatch someone within the next 24 hours. The promise was not enough to soothe Sophia's pounding heart, but she accepted it, thanked them, and ended the call. The phone slipped from her trembling hands onto the table, where it landed with a dull thud. She pressed her palms over her face, drawing in long, shaky breaths. It was done. She had called for help. She could no longer manage this alone. Yet even as relief flickered faintly in her chest, dread quickly snuffed it out. She could not rid herself of the image of the soil shifting, multiplying, breathing, and she could not help but feel that by the time the experts arrived, it would be far too late. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Sophia tried to go about her chores, but each task was interrupted by the constant urge to glance outside. Each time she looked, she thought the mounds appeared larger, though it was difficult to be sure. She saw the dog pacing restlessly from window to window, whining when he caught sight of the garden, his body tense with fear. She could not coax him out into the yard no more, not even to relieve himself. When dusk fell, the noises returned, stronger than ever. She sat in her living room with all the lights off, gripping a flashlight in her lap, the curtains drawn tightly across the windows. But the sounds came through the walls regardless. The muffled crackle of soil shifting, the faint hum like a chorus of unseen voices. Sometimes there was a vibration beneath her feet, so steady and deep it seemed to echo in her bones. Sleep was impossible. She moved from chair to chair, from room to room, always listening, always feeling as if the ground itself might give way. At one point, in the early hours of the morning, she thought she saw movement outside her window, a ripple across the lawn as though the earth itself shifted under an invisible wave. Her throat closed in terror. She pulled the curtain shut again and pressed her back against the wall, her heart beating wildly. When dawn finally broke again, Sophia was exhausted but resolute. She stepped carefully out onto her porch, the air heavy with humidity and sharp in the early light. Her dog followed reluctantly, sticking close to her legs, his head low. She surveyed the yard and nearly gasped. The largest mound was monstrous now, nearly as tall as her waist, its surface cracked open like a broken shell to reveal dark cavities within. The smaller mounds had swelled overnight, rising in uneven clusters, and new ones dotted the far edge of the yard near the fence. She could see the grass between them thinning, the soil cracked and pale, and in some places, the earth seemed to sink, leaving shallow depressions. As she stood staring, the ground beneath the nearest mound shifted visibly, sending a ripple of loose soil sliding down its side. A sudden burst of ants poured forth, a seething, red-brown torrent that spread across the ground in coordinated motion. Sophia stumbled back, her breath catching. They did not pursue her, but their sheer numbers made her head swim. They moved like a single living organism, every individual guided by the same relentless drive. She turned and hurried back inside, slamming the door and locking it as if a simple latch could keep them out. By mid-morning, she was pacing her kitchen, checking the window every few minutes, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. Each time she peered outside, the mounds loomed larger, closer. She imagined the tunnels stretching beneath her house, beneath her feet, undermining the very foundation. She pressed her palms against the countertop to steady herself, whispering aloud that the experts would come, that they had promised, that she only had to wait. But patience was impossible when every sound seemed a warning, every tremor an omen of collapse. When the phone rang at last, she nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. The same calm voice informed her that a team had been dispatched and was on their way, expected to arrive within the hour. Relief and terror mingled in her chest, for she was grateful they were coming, but a part of her feared what they might find, what they might confirm about the nightmare beneath her soil. She thanked them again, her voice shaking, and ended the call. Then she sat by the window, staring out at the advancing mounds, her heart pounding in time with the unseen vibrations below. She felt no triumph, no sense of victory for having sought help at last. Instead, she felt like a woman sitting in a besieged fortress, waiting for rescuers who might already be too late. As the minutes dragged on and the sounds beneath the earth grew louder, Sophia realized that her garden, once her refuge and pride, had become an alien landscape she no longer recognized. The soil was not soil anymore, it was a veil stretched thin over something vast and insatiable, the thing that had claimed her home as its territory. All she could do now was wait, knowing that every moment of delay meant the infestation grew deeper, wider, stronger. The urgent call she had made was not just a plea for help, it was a confession of defeat. And though she could not yet know it, the arrival of the experts would mark not the end of her terror but its true beginning. When the white van rolled down the narrow gravel road and pulled into her driveway, Sophia was already standing at the window, watching with eyes that had not closed for more than a few minutes in 2 nights. Her body was tense with anticipation, shoulders rigid and breath caught in her throat. The dog beside her barked sharply at the sight of strangers approaching, but his tone lacked the carefree excitement he once reserved for visitors. Instead, it carried a low edge of unease, as if he too sensed that the van brought not relief but confirmation of something dreadful. Sophia placed a hand on his head to calm him, though her own pulse raced faster as the men stepped out. There were 3 of them, dressed in khaki uniforms with the company logo stitched above their shirt pockets. They carried cases of equipment and spoke to one another in low voices, their gestures brisk and businesslike. Sophia forced herself to breathe and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch as they approached. The morning air was heavy with humidity, and the mounds in her yard loomed in the distance like a cluster of malignant tumors swelling out of the earth. She saw the experts glance toward them, their expressions shifting from casual indifference to cautious curiosity. "You must be Miss Carter," the man in front said as he climbed the steps, offering his hand. He was tall, with thinning hair and the calm, weathered face of someone who had spent years in the field. "I'm Thomas. This is Robert, and that's Daniel. You mentioned a large infestation. We are here to take a look." Sophia shook his hand briefly, her fingers cold and clammy despite the heat. "It's worse than I could explain over the phone," she said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, thin and tired. She gestured toward the garden. "Please, you'll see." They followed her into the yard, their boots crunching on the brittle grass. At first, they moved with professional detachment, but as soon as they reached the edge of the nearest mound, their confidence faltered. Sophia saw it in the way Thomas's eyes widened, the way Robert shifted uneasily on his feet, the way Daniel muttered something under his breath. The main mound now stood waist-high, its surface cracked and shifting, and all around it, the smaller mounds had swelled like malignant offspring. The soil between them sagged in shallow depressions, as though hollow beneath, and faint vibrations traveled through the ground with each step. "Good Lord," Thomas whispered. He crouched near the edge of the mound, running his gloved hand across the soil. It collapsed under his touch, crumbling into loose grains. He withdrew quickly, brushing his hand clean, and turned to the others. "Get the equipment." Robert and Daniel hurried back to the van, returning with cases of instruments that Sophia had never seen before. They unpacked a portable ground-penetrating radar unit, assembling it with swift, practiced motions. Sophia hovered nearby, wringing her hands, watching as they rolled the sensor across the soil and studied the monitor. The screen glowed in the morning light, casting their faces in pale blue. Thomas bent close, his brow furrowing. Sophia edged nearer, peering over his shoulder. What she saw made her stomach lurch. On the display, beneath the surface of her garden, stretched a labyrinth of passages. They spread out in all directions like veins through flesh, twisting and intersecting, a sprawling network that seemed to reach far beyond the borders of a yard. Some tunnels were thin like pencil lines, edged in darkness, but others were wide, cavernous voids that suggested chambers large enough for thousands of insects. The sheer scale of it was staggering. "It's enormous," Daniel murmured, his voice low with disbelief. He pointed to the screen. "Look how far it goes. I've never seen anything like this." Thomas's jaw tightened. "This isn't just a nest. This is a whole system. Could be millions of them down there." He straightened abruptly, scanning the yard with sharp, appraising eyes. "We need to be careful." Sophia's knees weakened, and she gripped the porch railing for support. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you it wasn't normal." Thomas turned to her, his face pale but steady. "Miss Carter, I need you to go inside. Lock the doors. Stay away from the windows. We'll keep looking, but it may not be safe for you out here." His tone left no room for argument. Sophia nodded quickly, retreating back toward the house. Her heart hammered. She paused at the door, glancing over her shoulder just as the radar unit gave a faint beep. The screen flared brighter, the shape shifting as the sensors penetrated deeper. Thomas leaned in, then stiffened visibly, his face drained of color. He barked something to his colleagues that Sophia could not hear, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Both men froze, then stepped back from the mound as though it might explode. Sophia's breath caught. For a long moment, she stood frozen at the threshold, torn between the urge to stay and the instinct to flee. Then Thomas turned sharply toward her, his voice carrying across the yard. "Inside now. Don't wait. Get inside immediately." The authority in his command jolted her into action. She yanked the door open and slammed it behind her, fumbling with the lock as her dog whined and barked beside her. She pressed her back against the door, panting, her whole body trembling. Through the window, she could see the men retreating toward the van, their equipment abandoned near the mound. Their faces were grim, their movements quick and deliberate. They were afraid. Inside the safety of her kitchen, Sophia sank into a chair, her heart racing. Fear pulled in her stomach, heavy and cold. The experts had come, just as she had begged, but their reaction confirmed her worst suspicions. This was not an infestation they could simply treat with powder or poison. This was something larger, something dangerous enough to make seasoned professionals blanch and retreat. The certainty of that truth pressed down on her, suffocating in its weight. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, she could not tell. Time seemed to lose its meaning as she sat in silence, listening to the muffled sounds of movement outside. Occasionally, she heard Thomas's voice, clipped and urgent, as he spoke into his radio. The others moved swiftly, their footsteps heavy on the porch as they gathered what equipment they could carry. At one point, she dared to peek through the curtains and saw them standing in a huddle near the van, speaking in low, tense voices. Thomas gestured toward the house, his expression grim, then turned back toward the mounds. From within, Sophia felt faint tremors once more, vibrations that passed through the soles of her feet and into her bones. It was like being perched above some vast, restless engine that never ceased. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly in her chair, whispering prayers she had not uttered in years. She thought of her garden as it had been, lush, green, full of life, and of the dark labyrinth now revealed beneath it. The contrast was unbearable. At last, there came a knock on the door, firm but not frantic. Sophia rose on unsteady legs and opened it just enough to see Thomas's face. He looked older somehow, the lines of worry etched deeply around his eyes. "We've contacted additional support," he said quietly. "This is beyond our scope. Specialists are on their way, along with wildlife authorities. Until they arrive, you need to stay inside. Do not go near the yard. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak. He gave her a brief, sympathetic look, then turned away, walking quickly back toward his team. The van doors slammed shut, and the engine roared to life. They did not leave, she realized. They were waiting, standing by as reinforcements were summoned, but the sound of that idling motor filled the air like a nervous heartbeat. Sophia closed the door again, locking it carefully. She leaned against it, eyes closed, and felt the weight of her helplessness settle over her. The experts had come, and even they had recoiled. Whatever lay beneath her soil was not merely an infestation, it was far larger, enough to rattle hardened professionals. She pressed her palms flat against the wood, feeling the vibrations that still seeped faintly through the ground into her home, and she knew with a chill and certainty that her life had crossed into a territory from which there was no return. The air around Sophia's house grew heavier as the hours passed. The experts had not left, but their presence offered no comfort. Their van idled near the end of the drive, its engine a low rumble beneath the drone of cicadas that had begun to rise with the heat of the day. Through the cracks in her curtains, she saw them pacing back and forth, speaking into radios, occasionally glancing toward the mounds with quick, uneasy looks. She understood from their faces that what they had discovered on the monitor had shaken them deeply. They had tried to mask their fear at first, speaking in clipped, professional tones, but the truth could not be hidden. This was not an ordinary nest, not a problem solved with sprays and powders. It was something far larger, something alive and growing beneath the very soil of her property, and it was dangerous enough to make men who prided themselves on handling infestations retreat and call for help. By mid-afternoon, more vehicles began to arrive. The first was a dark SUV with state markings on the side, followed by a truck carrying equipment she could not name. Uniformed men stepped down, some carrying cases, others shouldering heavy packs. They did not smile, did not greet one another casually, but moved with the tense precision of people summoned for a crisis. Sophia watched from the narrow gap in her curtains as they fanned out around the yard, surveying the scene. The mounds loomed larger now than they had even that morning, their surfaces cracked like volcanic earth, the soil shifting as if stirred from below by invisible tides. One of the officials, a woman in a dark green uniform, bent low to examine the ground near the largest mound. She wore thick gloves and goggles, and her every movement was careful, deliberate. Sophia could not hear what she said, but she saw Thomas step forward and respond, gesturing toward the equipment they had abandoned earlier. The officials nodded gravely, and more men began unloading additional devices from their vehicles. Soon, the yard bristled with strange machines. Radar scanners, thermal imagers, heavy cylinders that gleamed metallic in the sun. The dog barked suddenly, a deep, frantic sound, and Sophia pulled him back from the window. Her own pulse thundered in her ears. She could see the faces of the men and women as they studied the readings, and she knew from the hard set of their jaws, from the way their voices tightened, that the situation was worse than they had expected. She could not stop herself from imagining the tunnels beneath her home stretching further and further, connecting chambers packed with swarming life. She thought of the ground hollowing out until it collapsed beneath her feet, her house sinking into a living mass of insects. The thought made her stomach twist, and her palms sweat. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, one of the officials stepped toward her porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and an expression that left no room for argument. When she opened the door a cautious crack, he spoke firmly. We need you to remain inside your house. This is a dangerous situation. We've contacted additional agencies to contain it. Until we give you word, do not step outside for any reason. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded mutely, her throat dry, her lips stiff. The man gave her a sharp nod in return and turned back toward the others. She closed the door again, leaning her forehead against the cool wood. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped by the unseen force that had risen from beneath her garden. Night fell, and with it came a chorus of sounds that chilled her blood. From every direction came the restless crackle of movement beneath the soil. Sometimes it rose in sudden surges, like waves battering against a shore, then faded again into a low hum. The floor of her house vibrated faintly, steady enough to rattle the dishes in her cupboards. Sophia sat in her kitchen with every light extinguished, listening in terror. Through the walls, she caught fragments of voices, radios crackling, boots crunching on gravel. The officials were still there, keeping watch, but their presence did little to quiet her fear. If anything, the gravity of their arrival only deepened her dread. Near midnight, there was a sudden burst of activity outside. Men shouted, equipment was dragged quickly across the yard, and floodlights flared to life, flooding the mounds in harsh white light. Sophia rushed to the window despite her fear, pulling back the curtain just enough to see. What she saw made her breath seize in her chest. The largest mound had ruptured open, its sides split in a jagged crack. From within swelled an unholy mass of ants, millions of them, their bodies glistening as they poured out in endless streams. The floodlights caught their movement, turning the seething tide into a nightmare of writhing shapes. The officials responded immediately, advancing with sprayers that released clouds of white mist, but the swarm resisted, surging outward only to retreat suddenly back into the crack as if guided by some hidden command. Sophia clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle the cry. Her dog whimpered at her side, pressing close to her legs. She stumbled backwards from the window, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. They were not simply insects reacting at random. They moved with purpose, withdrawing and advancing in coordinated waves, their numbers so vast that the ground itself seemed alive. She had thought herself prepared for anything, but the sight of that flood was beyond what her mind could easily grasp. The commotion outside continued for hours. She heard the roar of engines as more equipment was brought in, the clatter of metal as heavy containers were set in place, the steady bark of commands in clipped voices. Occasionally, she heard muffled booms, as though explosive charges were being set deep into the soil, followed by the acrid scent of chemicals drifting through her windows. Still, the sounds beneath the ground did not cease. The vibrations ran on, tireless, relentless, as though the colony beneath her yard stretched farther than any of them imagined. By dawn, she was hollow-eyed, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She stood at her window once more and saw the mounds now blackened and scarred from the night's assault, their surfaces coated in strange residues. Yet still they stood, taller than any ordinary nest had a right to be, their bases spreading wider across the yard. Around them, the grass was dead, the soil cracked and pale. She could see fresh fissures opening in the earth, thin lines that radiated outward toward the street, toward the neighbor's fence. When Thomas came again to her porch, his face was grave. He explained in a low voice that the ants were more aggressive than any species they had encountered. They did not scatter under attack but regrouped, responding with an organization that unsettled even the most experienced among them. Their stings, he said, were unusually severe, capable of causing dangerous reactions, even death. The colony itself, according to the latest radar scans, extended far beyond her property. It was not a simple infestation, it was, in his words, a biological threat. Sophia listened in silence, her stomach clenched, her mind barely able to hold the weight of his words. A biological threat. She thought of her garden, once her refuge, now transformed into a battlefield between man and something ancient, relentless, alien in its unity. She thought of her neighbors, unaware of the menace spreading beneath their feet, and she thought of her own home, standing fragile and temporary above a force vast enough to devour it whole. That evening, as the sun sank once more behind the cypress trees and the officials prepared for yet another night of containment, Sophia sat alone in her living room, staring at the trembling glass of water on the table before her. The vibrations never ceased. They passed through her walls, her floors, her very body. And she understood with a terrible clarity that her life, which had once been so ordinary, so filled with the simple joys of soil and seed, had been swallowed by something beyond her comprehension. The danger beneath her yard was no longer hidden. It was revealed now, terrible in its scope, undeniable in its power, and it would not rest until it had consumed everything in its path. The morning that followed the longest night of her life began not with birdsong or the comforting hum of cicadas, but with the shrill roar of heavy machinery pulling into the street. Sophia had not slept at all. She had sat up in her armchair, her eyes fixed on the window where floodlights had burned through the night, turning her once verdant garden into a ghastly stage upon which men in uniforms fought to contain the living tide beneath her soil. Her dog had curled up at her feet, his body trembling whenever the ground shook, his eyes wide and haunted. The vibration never stopped. It passed through the house like the heartbeat of something enormous, unseen but always present. When she rose to draw the curtains back, she saw a scene that filled her with both dread and disbelief. Enormous trucks had arrived, bringing with them massive steel containers and long hoses that snaked across her yard. A crew of men in protective suits moved with swift determination, their boots sinking into the soft, ruined earth. At the center of it all stood the mounds, swollen and cracked from the night's failed containment, their bulk so massive now that they looked less like nests and more like strange geological formations, unnatural hills that had no place in her garden. Even scarred by chemicals and scorched by fire, they endured, trembling faintly as though something within resisted with endless strength. Thomas appeared again at her porch, his face drawn with exhaustion. He carried a clipboard, but he barely looked at it as he spoke. His words were calm, but his voice carried the weight of finality. They had made the decision to flood the underground network with concrete. It was the only way, he explained, to prevent the colony from spreading beyond control. Poison had failed, fire had failed, even high-pressure chemical sprays had done little but stir the insects into frenzied waves. The colony's sheer size, its unnatural cohesion, its terrifying adaptability, none of it could be managed with ordinary means. The tunnels stretched too far, the numbers were too vast. Concrete, poured in massive volumes, would harden within the channels and chambers, locking the swarm in place, suffocating the life out of it beneath a tomb of stone. Sophia listened in silence, her mouth dry, her throat tight. She could only nod, though her stomach twisted at the thought. To bury an infestation beneath concrete was not pest control, it was an entombment. And yet, even she, with no knowledge of such things, knew it was necessary. Nothing else would hold back what lived under her yard, nothing else could stand against the tide of those endless millions moving as one. The work began at once. Trucks positioned themselves along the driveway, their engines rattling the windows. Men dragged the hoses toward the largest mound, anchoring the nozzles in place with heavy stakes. When the pumps roared to life, the ground shuddered with a new violence. Thick, grey slurry surged down into the earth, pouring through the cracks and fissures, vanishing into the hidden labyrinth below. Sophia clutched the window frame with both hands as she watched. At first, the soil seemed to resist, the mounds trembling violently as the ants erupted once more in furious waves, swarming up the hoses and protective boots of the workers. Men shouted, stomping and spraying, holding their ground while the concrete poured unrelentingly downward. The air filled with the acrid stench of chemical repellents, with the faint hiss of millions of tiny bodies shifting in rage. The swarm surged, withdrew, surged again. It was like watching a tide battering against a sea wall, desperate to break through. But slowly, agonizingly, the tide faltered. The slurry filled the tunnels, hardening as it spread. The cracks in the mounds grew, still the vibrations faded little by little. After hours of relentless pouring, the seething movement slowed. By late afternoon, silence fell over the garden for the first time in weeks. Sophia stood at the glass long after the pumps were shut down, staring at the hardened shapes that had once been mounds of shifting soil. They were no longer alive with tremors, no longer spilling forth rivers of insects. They stood motionless, fossilized under the weight of tons of concrete. The men moved cautiously among them, tapping the surfaces, testing their solidity. There were no eruptions now, no vibrations. The living force had been locked away. In the days that followed, the yard was transformed into something unrecognizable. Crews returned with excavators, digging carefully around the hardened masses. The ground split open under their machines, revealing extraordinary structures beneath. Sophia watched from her porch as the first of the massive casts was lifted free of the soil. What emerged looked like a sculpture of alien architecture. Vast chambers frozen in stone, tunnels twisting like veins, complex networks branching in patterns too intricate for human minds to design. The workers and scientists stood in awe, their voices hushed as if they had unearthed a cathedral. Word spread quickly. Within a week, news vans lined the narrow street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters clamored at the edges of a property, their voices breathless as they spoke of one of the largest fire ant colonies ever discovered. Photographs of the casts appeared online, showing the staggering complexity of the underground fortress that had lurked unseen beneath her modest garden. Sophia's name was whispered in headlines, her story told in brief clips that made her sound like a bystander in her own life. They said she had discovered the threat, they said her call for help had led to a monumental scientific find. But they did not speak of the nights she had lain awake listening to the soil breathe, of the way fear had settled into her bones like an incurable illness. Scientists arrived from universities, their voices tinged with awe as they described the colony. Some marveled at its scale, others at the evolutionary brilliance of its organization. They preserved the casts, cutting sections to display in laboratories and museums. A portion of the largest chamber was transported intact to a facility in Baton Rouge, where it would be studied as both a natural wonder and a warning. Sophia heard them speak of it as a monument, an extraordinary testament to the power of collective life. But to her, it was a tombstone, a grave marker over the thing that had stolen her peace and invaded her home. Her garden was gone. The soil was scarred, the plants destroyed, the air heavy with the memory of chemicals and machinery. The house still stood, but it no longer felt like hers. At night, she sat by the window and stared at the hardened shapes that remained, the concrete protrusions rising like relics. She tried to imagine the silence as safety, but her ears still rang with phantom vibrations, her body still braced for the tremors that had once rattled her dishes and kept her awake. She dreamed of the swarm often. Dreams of countless bodies moving as one, of soil collapsing beneath her feet, of being swallowed whole into darkness. Neighbors spoke of selling their homes, of moving away. Some blamed her for calling attention to the problem, although she had only tried to survive. Others thanked her, saying the authorities might never have known if not for her insistence. Sophia listened to them but felt detached, as though her life had become a story told by others, a spectacle replayed on the evening news. She no longer recognized her quiet days, her peaceful gardening, her evenings spent humming to herself as she watered her tomatoes. That world was gone. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in deepening gold and the air grew still, she stepped outside onto her porch with her dog at her side. The yard lay before her, barren and strange, scarred by the excavation, dominated by the fossilized remains of the mounds. She stared at them in silence for a long time, her chest tight. They would stand there for years, perhaps forever, monuments to what had lived and thrived unseen. People would come to study them, to marvel at their design, to speak in reverent tones of the power of nature's architects. But only she would remember what it felt like when the ground trembled with their restless hunger, when she had stood alone in her kitchen with fear pressing against her ribs like a vice. Her life had been rewritten by the thing beneath her soil. She was no longer simply a woman with a garden in Louisiana. She was a woman whose yard had revealed a hidden world, whose refuge had been consumed by a colony of fire and fury. And as she stood there in the dimming light, the cicada silent, the air thick and waiting, she felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. Though the ground was quiet now, though the threat was entombed and studded, she would never again look at her land without wondering what else might stir beneath, hidden, patient, waiting for its time to rise. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking story.